Okay, I think we can
Okay.
start. Yes. Okay,
All
so I will
right.
just say a few words before uh, um, our speaker starts the presentation today, the webinar today. So this seminar is being live streamed for off-campus postgraduate students, staff, and other interested people who can ask questions at the end of the presentation using their computer audio or via the chat box. This session will also be recorded, and the recording will be available on the department's website. Can I just please ask all attendees to switch off their cameras, to switch off your cameras and mute your microphone during the presentation? Thank you. I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker, Radhika Gajjala, who is professor at Bowling Green State University. She researches gender in online contexts. Her latest book is titled Digital Diasporas, Labor and Affect in Gender Indian Digital Publics. And currently, she's working on a co edited book on gender and digital labor. Radhika is an internationally recognized scholar in the area of digital education, the subaltern digital methods, and today she will be talking about digital ethnography and how it is not just reading text online. Welcome, Radhika, and over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Just making sure. Thank you very much for inviting me, Natasha, and for Dee for dealing with all my emails and everybody else behind the scenes who are organizing. So I'm just going to jump right in. And of course, we'll have a Q&A section. I have a lot of text heavy uh, PowerPoint because then it'll help you guys see what I'm talking about, but also because I just started writing the paper and I started making the PowerPoint. So, yeah, so let's get to it, right? So what we're talking about is digital ethnography and the buzz that's happening nowadays, where everybody, I mean, several of us I know we've been trying it. We've been working on this since the 90s and even the 80s. We've been pottering around in this cyber cultures, and tentatively kind of making a claim that what we're doing is ethnography or what we're doing is living online, and suddenly COVID-19 hits and everybody's online almost, right? And so or rather, only the people who are visible, who are online are visible to us, which is a strange kind of a situation when we remember that when people started to live online, it began to be considered as not real. So I want to hold on to that binary throughout the talk so we can um, you know, revisit that. So, when we're talking about digital ethnography, I want to make these really blunt claims, blunt statements. It can be done through digital living and inhabiting the digital. And the question about what that is something to think about and unpack. Remote research is not and has never been ethnography, but it does become sometimes a component of what we do. There's a difference between qualitative interviews, which, a lot of us are being told by our IRBs, HSRBs, and IRBs to edit our consent forms to say that we will be interviewing you through distance modes because of social distancing. Those are qualitative interviews. They're not ethnographic interviews. And even those of us who are used to doing ethnography offline, anthropologists and others are becoming confused because we're feeling like we're in that mode of, oh, we're doing ethnographic interviews, but qualitative interviews by and of themselves are not ethnographic interviews, right? So, and I apologize if some of these things are very basic, but it's kind of laying the ground line and groundwork for all I'm saying. solely relying on things like data scraping, right? All the wonderful tools we have, using Python, R, Gephi, everything, and sentiment analysis, topic modeling, textual and visual analysis, good old textual and visual analysis from long ago. These are not digital ethnography in and of themselves. However, the ethnographic approach does require us to deploy a variety of data gathering methods. Repeat, repeat, repeat. Ethnography is methodology, um, that uses multiple methods. It doesn't necessarily only use qualitative methods, it does use also quantitative methods. So, what is this digital living that we keep talking about? How do we know we are digital or not? When, where? So you know, being a parent of a computer scientist, a software engineer, I know that I always get pushed back because there are technical explanations of what it means to be digital, right? And of course, the very software engineer is also a gamer, so he lives online a lot, and I got to watch that from his childhood. So the digital is repeatedly experienced as new, right? So now, every year, those of us who've been researching digital environments, going back to the teams, you know, all, I owe my insights to a lot of people who are out there, Nancy Bain, Annette Markham, Susanna Pasanan, Lisa Nakamura, Jonathan Stern, so many other people. I mean, they'll keep coming back and forth. I mean, everybody. I've just named people randomly based on who came to my mind, but they're all there. So when we're talking about this plan, we're relying on a kind of a technological, almost planned obsolescence that every time we enter this digital, we're actually facing a new kind of gadget, right? Or a new interface. However, the interface is made kind of seamless, and we're somehow supposed to have the skills to enter it. Now, when we enter from one room to another, we are not aware of having to relearn the skill of walking. We are not aware of having to relearn the skill of maybe sitting down and monitoring our face. However, if we go into an environment of a different culture, sometimes we may also not know what the different objects around us are for. So, for instance, when I first started teaching about digital environments, I would take them into text-based moves, even when I was teaching a course such as intercultural communication, because honestly, this is also the colonial paradigm of anthropology, right? If you walk into a space and you recognize a chair as a chair, it actually is a chair in the context that you live in. It is not necessarily a chair in the context of the people that whose lives you have entered. They might be treating it as a footstool. They might actually be using it as a dining table, whatever else you want to call it. So it was very useful for me to make my students enter the text-based mood to think through these issues of what you name something as may not be its function, right? Object-oriented. So object-oriented is not just the highly sophisticated software now that people talk about, but also back to the text-based muds and moves of the 80s and 90s. So part of what this digital living is then reinforced for us in an always iterative looping back to newness because of planned obsolescence, but also because new generations and new users keep entering, right? So a lot of the things that previously 20 years ago in terms of netiquette we may have figured out or put into place gets kind of toppled down as new users come in into Zoom or other places. And I think Lisa Nakamura has been working on trash talk and other things related to some of these issues. Um, so, the digital is not just one culture, but we treat it as one culture because we say, okay, we're entering the computer, we're entering the saw, the gadget. It is one culture, but even though it is not one culture, it's multiple cultures. We also live in it. One of the, I remember what a reviewer once asked me when I started to make the argument for digital diasporas, and many people have made the argument. This by no means new, but I make it in a kind of unique way, in the way that I say that. For instance, in the article I wrote on sari trails, I also made the argument that software offshore workers are part of digital diasporas. So that confuses people in that, because we're not talking about diasporas of physical migration, but we're talking about diasporas of um, seemingly disembodied migration. But the time zones have shifted, and we are living in it in a different sense. So, what is unique about the digital is that we talk about living in it in a way that we didn't think about in terms of print, even though Benedict Anderson made the argument, imagined community, it's not quite the same as living in your so-called imagined community, which, by the way, isn't quite imagined. It's there. So this innatness is unique. It's a there is here-ness, and it's a blurring of here and there, private and public. Is Gibsonian, right? We imagine the possibility, for instance, of augmented reality, of magic beaming in and out, liminal spaces blurring, of temporal and physical boundaries, body boundaries. We are object oriented and in an affective sense. But the question here is, have we always been object oriented in this particular very subjective affective sense? And I'll leave you with that thinking. Um, these mediations of this affect, the mediation of the private and the public, as accepted, as given, as received, um, are put into question. So, because public and private, frankly, are boundaries created by us. Who can touch me? Who cannot touch me? How can you touch me? How can you not? These are all defined by infrastructures of power and predetermined ways of how do we protect ourselves, or how do we offer ourselves to others. So in that sense, while we have huge arguments about how algorithmic cultures are invisible to the lay user, we also have invisible infrastructures in our everyday. And when we forget the whys and hows of what we do and how we do it, right? And if we didn't forget it, we wouldn't be able to function. So let me go back a little more to my slides, which I keep forgetting to use. Uh, Sarah Pink et al., um, they have a book on digital ethnography, and they say it well, right in the beginning. Digital environments, methods, and methodologies are indeed redefining ethnographic practice. So, on the one hand, there's an argument that was made way back in the 90s and 2000s that ethnography is needed for internet research, for digital research. On the other hand, these very environments are redefining what it means to do ethnography. So the role of digital ethnography in challenging the concepts that have been traditionally defined as units of analysis. So you can read the rest. I think I've left it open long enough that you can read it. In any case, it's in Pink et al.'s introduction, just the very first page. I want to go to the next slide, where good old Miller and Slater from long ago, the internet and ethnographic approach, right? Now we call everything digital, but this was the internet research, cyber culture. So they made an argument, right, long ago, saying, asking why we should do an ethnography of Trinidad or of Trinidad on the internet, right? And if you notice, it was implicitly already talking about the internet as a place. So you see, there's a distinction, because, and you see, contrary to the first generation of internet literature, the internet is not a monolithic or placeless. Cyberspace, rather, it is numerous new technologies used by diverse people in diverse real world, or if you'd like, offline or world locations. Hence, there's everything to be gained by an ethnographic approach. And I think we could still kind of use this to talk about the current moment. So why digital? Why ethnography? What is digital living? I think I jumped ahead of myself a little bit. When you, an example I was also thinking about, just because I know that one of my audience here might be somebody who's a GP. Um, a shout out to her, she's here. So when you think about doctors and how they diagnose the patient remotely in the current moment, is it just in the Zoom moment that they're diagnosing the patient remotely, or has it always been included aspects of remote diagnosis, right? It becomes visible now. So X-rays, ultrasound, even checking the pulse, they might, in a way, might be considered remote in degrees. Evidence of disease is assessed, recognized, even guessed at based on prior and continuing experience and learning. And I think that's the key, right? Prior and continuing experience and learning, because we as ethnographers have to be in a learning space at a continuous and repeated and iterative pace. So for instance, when I was doing my offline ethnography with collaborators in India in handloom weaving communities, oh, she's here. She missed that part. Anyway, so I had to go learn, kind of start dabbling in even weaving and spinning, because I had to learn how to do that. So when we think about how a doctor diagnoses a patient remotely, it's not just remote as in mediated by the computer or the gadget, but also mediated through X-rays, ultrasound, even the examining of the pulse. So again, going back to the 2000s, we would Espen Aarseth of Norway, um, and digital cultures and game studies fame, said, um, and just as cyberculture is already all over the place, cyber studies might be assimilated into old disciplines. So at that time, we used to call it cyber ethnography, right? So cyber ethnography will become ethnography, cyber law will become law, and cyber media will become media. However, that didn't happen. Partly that arguments were made that that didn't happen because we needed faculty lines, but I beg to differ. There is more than just faculty lines for new media and digital media. There is the fact that we are constantly reinventing the new, depending on, and we are constantly inviting in new users into multiple technologically mediated environments. So what happens when we think in terms of digital and ethnography in relation to the digital? And relationality is, of course, key to any kind of ethnography that we do. We have always encountered the embodiment crisis. Am I physically there in Lancaster? I am not. I am here. But does that mean that I do not have a body? And does my physical space around me matter? Does it matter that I am only showing you the only possible clean spot in this room that used to be my son's room? Anyway, so when we read Rape in Cyberspace by Julian Dibble, and you can Google that if you don't know what that is. It is an article written by Julian Dibble way back in the days of the text-based Muds and Boos again. I'd always face this problem and of people reading it as if it's words. They could not understand why a word, um, you know, created all this violence. I mean, it's not verbal violence, it's not textual violence. It is very much rape in the sense of redefining rape as an affective experience. And what that makes you think about, so what that made me do was I had to think about ways in which students would have to experience being in a space where their body could be taken out. Just briefly, this article describes an incident where an avatar, a digital body of somebody in Moose Space was taken over by a dorm of students at New York uh, who themselves were one digital character in this Moose Space. Now, so the point here is that and then they had a great time trying to create the scenario of by taking technically and taking over this avatar and creating a scenario of this avatar being raped and all the other stuff. And the person who owned the avatar, the username, the whatever you want to call it, whose character was being treated in this manner, physically felt violated, was upset, was traumatized. So this raises the question about again the body and the affect, but also about the issue of when is even physical rape considered rape, right? So we might also think about a recent incident in India, since that's where my research sometimes tends to be, as in India and the digital. Uh, we've heard in the news that there's a judge who was trying to say that the rapist should marry the minor that he has raped. And you're kind of thinking in his framework, then rape is just the act of sex and illegal sex. So you're wondering, wow. And so the point there is, I had to take people into experiencing being in the digital through entering the text-based muds and moos in those days to get them to understand what it meant. And of course, when you can access text in reading, but you can't access text when you go into places, it creates a lot of frustration. When you cannot produce yourself with a great deal of comfort, it produces doubt and uncertainty. Um, However, the crisis of virtual and real comes up in different ways. And in this quote that comes from, I think, either notes or from an article that I wrote, um, I was constantly having to think about the truth of the story of the people that I was meeting, and what they told me, which makes you think, right? Of all the crises that have happened in anthropology, where your informants likely told you things, and then a very famous anthropologist comes away and writes about this exotic island somewhere based on stories told, and the rest of the world, being neo-colonial as we are, is willing to believe exactly what that anthropologist writes. And the people there may not have told her or him exactly what their experience or what they're going through is, right? So enacting digital materiality is key here. What we are doing is we are enacting a particular kind of materiality. Um, and that's where I had to take my classes into epistemologies of doing or pedagogies of doing as I started to, because it became an epistemic issue. Of course, it's ontological, but it's epistemic when you have to try to understand how something is you know happening, how you come into being. We don't sit down every day and think, how did I come into being? How did I, appear here in my physical space? I might think about how did this glass get made through pottery? I might think about how did my yarn get made, my crochet shawl get made, but I won't always sit down and think about the how of how I came into being. However, when we think about the early years of typing yourself into existence, and this is where Jenny Sanden long ago wrote about material virtualities. And of course, we know Carolyn Marwin's work, when old technologies were new. We drew, my students and I, we drew on these to write about this. And we were like, oh, what's happening here is we are producing ourselves in this environment. And so what's interesting, of course, now in the Zoom time is there's a disappearance of this production of online, is this assumption that somehow I am, but I still had to produce myself online, but I also had to literally produce myself offline. So I look kind of okay-ish offline. I'm not going to look 20 years younger, but at least okay-ish. So, so this act of producing yourself becomes, I mean, I know Judith Butler is talking about the performativity and performance of selves, but when you think about these issues in relation to the digital, you kind of think about the technologies of production in quite present ways, right? Not in seamless ways. So when we start to work with, if I'm running out of time, please let me know, Natasha and Dee and everybody else. I tend to just drag on and talk. So when we encounter this space, right, we encounter a kind of a displacement. A displacement, I would say, that you encounter the minute you step outside the immigration checking place, or and out into the world when you travel too, but you don't experience what we feel as disembodiment. This sense of disembodiment, lag, I mean, the Zoom lag, for instance, affects us in different ways, in which we don't even notice. This whole almost year, or more than a year for several of you, or for some of you less than a year, we've been on Zoom for a lot of the time, but the lag affects us in different ways. It affects our eyes in different ways when we get screening, but we don't really think about that as much as we think about disembodiment. If we are, for instance, playing a computer game, or we are on in these maybe the good old Second Life, or we are thinking about being in text-based moves, or or we're still imagining the possibility of augmented reality and thinking about how that reorients embodiments. So the question always comes up to us is whether the body, where is the body? The body is here and there. Here in this Zoom space where I'm talking, we have a place, but we're not going to consider it a place because you can't really actually touch the Zoom space where we all are. And I can't really reach out to actually shake hands or touch with, or give anybody a hug or anything, right? But there is a place been made here. So there's a kind of placemaking that happens, but just to say that it's placemaking doesn't in itself create the place, right? We create the place, we create the environment, we inhabit it. So when we think about methods, as we go back to good old social science research, SCS research, and quote John Law here, we think of methods as assemblages, um, but they're also enactments of relations that make some things, representations, objects, apprehensions present in here, while making others absent out there. So in my place, some of you may exist, some of you, because I don't see your videos, you don't exist, but your names exist. So anyway, in there, out there, in here, out there is a concept that, yes, hi Satya. I saw you. Sorry, I can't see everyone else, so apologies if I'm not recognizing. It's just that she popped up. The making of ethnography is then artisanal. tied to the worldly work of writing, as James Clifford said, and it's still so. Just because we're in the digital doesn't, it's more so if at all possible. So this is, of course, where, my lure towards thinking about makers, not just because we're full of making cultures nowadays everywhere, but also because the process of making in itself is connected to how we make ourselves. And so, what does this enacted materialities lead us to think about? Practices that enable the embodiment. Again, here, Lisa Blackman has done a huge amount of work on thinking through what the body is, the corporeal body, the affective body, the boundaries that we lay around and call the body. So there are several ways in which we could unpack and deconstruct this idea of the body. The partiality of cultural and historical, sorry, I'm going back. Partiality of culture, role and historical truths, the ways they are systematic and exclusive. I think that when you try to do digital ethnography, all these become kind of visible to us, but there's a key problem that we face when people try to say, I'm doing digital ethnography, I know all about the digital. I think the more experienced and researchers don't say that. I think we compel our students to implicitly in academia and the ivory tower to have the answer to it all. And also, when you end up saying that you are a digital researcher and you are, or an internet researcher, people want to sit back and ask you about everything possible, because again, the digital is treated as one thing. However, one thing, neither is the world around us one thing. I cannot tell you that my way of sitting down is the perfect way. I mean, maybe the perfect way, but is the only way that other people should be sitting down or will be sitting down. Should is a different issue, but will be sitting down just based on my experience, right? And in that sense, ethnography is about a a subjective experience of the other, and our constant attempt in almost like a Sherlock Holmesian way, or Miss Marple way, to constantly try to unravel this mystery of any one thing or any several things and any several relations. So we're always already partial in our findings. There are no absolutes, and I don't think it's any scientist would also say that they have all the answers. um, so consider then, in doing digital ethnography, time and space, right? Then is remote research the same as ethnography? No. But is remote research a part of ethnography? Yes, more so nowadays than ever. Um, so in a conversation I was having over when we were forced into remote research space and we were doing work last semester around Africa and COVID, a lot of the actual offline researchers were in Africa, while a few of us were not, and most significantly, my class was working with them, and they were not. So this became, but then. We were talking to people who were anthropologists and others who said, well, we in the field we take notes. Yes, you take detailed notes, and so my observations come from those notes. And do we necessarily have to have detailed transcripts or records of the conversations? And this again is a difference between qualitative interviews and ethnographic interviews. Ethnographic interviews, you don't always have detailed transcribing. You don't always have, you make notes, but your notes are important. You have to make total detailed notes. However, if you're doing remote research, um, that you do need those words. You need the words from the people, otherwise you can't make sense. So the point was, you can't conflate the idea of being in the field and then qualitative interviews through remote, right? So one thing I started pushing on is the fact that I don't know anything about these people that have been interviewed as much as the people themselves living in those environments. So it became quite clear that field notes come in a different field notes for digital come differently from field notes from being offline, but also just interviewing somebody on their use of a gadget or their use of a game does not itself allow you to understand the here-ness or the there-ness. It's one particular mode. Then we get back to my favorite Doreen Massey, who talks about time and talks about this trip from Manchester to Liverpool, um, and makes us aware of the fact that while we think about this as a spatial mu, it's also temporal, right? If I was, in Manchester maybe 10 years ago, it's probably totally different. So the temporal becomes very obvious to me. But those of you over there who stay, who were, or I don't know if your public transportation is functioning perfectly now, COVID and all, but still, those of you who've been going back and forth like on a daily basis, even then, there's a temporal shift. And so the experience of having coffee in the same coffee shop, in the same place, um, in the Sheffield train station may not be the same even if you go 10 minutes later. So, yeah. So the answering the how question through immersion and enactment is important when we are doing digital ethnography. Lots of field notes about how we are enacting ourselves. So the becoming self and other aware. So yeah, so an ethnographer will basically be curious about everything, right? So stub your toe on the beach, you examine the rock in detail. That kind of reminds me of my mother, but yeah. Um, anyway, so research environments utilizing, and we here I'm quoting Annette Markham, another of my buddies from early research of the internet, where she says research environments utilizing various internet media must undergo careful evaluation as each decision one makes throughout the course of a research project makes a difference. Testing various mediated environments and reflecting on the associated characteristics can help one discern which might be most suitable for the particular participants or research questions. So, evaluating the research environment is not just a matter of looking at the tools and the technologies, but also reflexively interrogating the self as a researcher to understand one's own assumptions and habitual practices. And I just want to throw in one more example or a vignette from a class where I was teaching research methods, and one of the students it's a course in Stratcom, strategic communication. So these are mostly already grown-ups working in the outside world. Not that, a lot of PhD students are not grown-ups, but the attitude to taking a class would be different. And they were doing a research project trying to understand how the millennials or post millennials, it's no longer the millennials, were using are tech savvy. So the assumption that they made was that owning and being able to use this made them tech savvy because they're texting, or even if you can use Instagram or whatever or Snapchat, you're tech savvy. However, the interviews she did, she began to realize that the users themselves did not perceive themselves as tech savvy, which is good on them, right? They did realize that just because they knew how to operate a cell phone didn't mean they were completely and wholly knowledgeable about that. So this actually then highlights the problem with this whole assumption of digital natives but versus the other stuff. So yeah, I'm going back to I'm teaching a course in methods as usual in American culture studies. And so we're reading this book on American studies. And I like this quote from Deloria and Olson on their American Studies reader, where they say anthropologists are amongst the staunchest of the notion that experience is epistemologically significant. Sorry about that. Stutter, which is another way of saying that books aren't the only way of generating knowledge. Good ethnographic research can draw on both book smarts and street smarts, and on the ability to continually, repeatedly recognize your points of ignorance. Well, the first thing we have to do when we're researching is to say, I don't know anything about this. So finally, I want to say thanks. If I spoke too fast or too long, I apologize. I do want to say thanks to all who've journeyed with me in these investigations. Some of you don't even know you've been journeying with me in my research investigations. Some of you know, but I do want to thank all co-authors, co-researchers, students, avatars, and of course, a whole bunch of people's works that I drew on in talking about this. It was a pleasure talking. Now I hope to see some more people around me. Thank you.
Thank you, Radhika. That was a fascinating talk. So I would now invite everyone present, present, digitally present. So now we're talking about embodiment, disembodiment, digital present or not, right, to ask questions and enter a discussion about very many different things you referred to, because I think it opens up a lot of interesting spaces, and there is a lot of food for thought there. I may start maybe, if that's okay, and ask what your advice would be for anyone interested in doing digital ethnography in terms of how they would approach it, like where to start. So, and what kind of methodological steps you would think, they need, or you would advise they need to think about in order to, develop a kind of digital ethnographic study, in your opinion?
I will, not to sound flippant, but I'd say start with a point of ignorance. Don't start with thinking you don't know anything. And then, of course, where do you start? You start with what you have in front of you first, because unless we start with something that's in front of us, we're not going to. A lot of people think that, oh, I'm going to write about all these ICTs in the global South, and I'm going to have to travel there and do it. And so they forget that they have first. This is where the self-reflexivity comes, right? You have to first understand where you are. So I would start with yourself, and start to make those field notes, and then you will begin to move towards that direction of what you are going to define as your object of research. The objects of research in a broad category will keep shifting, but I hope that was like a general answer, but yeah.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else?
Try.
Yes, sure.
Okay.
Please.
Thank you so much for that very voice savvy presentation, Radhika. I really enjoyed it. Just question is that we have a lot of PhD students actually attending this session at the moment. So one of the questions that I had, like probably years ago, maybe it can be something shareable, going back to basic of definition of digital ethnography. One thing kind of made me confused at the beginning was, is digital ethnography should be ethnography on about digital lives, or it's like ethnography using digital artifacts or digital data. So I mean, your presentation entirely is trying to blur that like kind of boundary. That's the impression I get, but still, I mean, it can be some of the curiosity that students are having. So if you can define it more clearly, which one you really think that it is, that would be great.
Sure. I would say that the best way to do it is to blur it, but I think when you start out, I understand the dilemma. When you start out, you kind of wonder what to do. So so we're all living digitally in different ways. let me think. What you're actually talking about is methods, not the methodological approach of ethnography, but you're talking about methods. So for instance, in a recent project, and a shout out to my team students, if anybody's bothered to come in here is this early, which is fine, they shouldn't have. Um, um, uh, we've been examining the use of data analytic tools. We're not quantitative researchers. We do not understand these as quantitative researchers. But what's fascinating about the ability to scrape data, for instance, using the open source software called Gephi, is what Gephi does to those data points, and what the various algorithms of Gephi do. And here I want to also bring in what Jill Redberg calls as situated data analytics. Jill Redberg's of University of Bergen, and how qualitative researchers then, feminist researchers then think in terms of, vignettes and situated. So we basically just use whatever we can. We just enter the space. So what we wanted to do was to, last year in the International Women's Day, there was a hashtag, She Inspires Us, that I believe was proposed by the powers that be in India as a way to highlight who they thought were ideal women. Because in the face of something else that was happening on the ground then, because this was before everybody was sent away to shelter in place, there was an anti, there were protest movements happening in Delhi, and I won't go into detail. Some of you know it. There was in those protest movements, there was highlighted the visibility of the women in these protest spaces. And obviously there's a lot of young people on social media influencers magnifying this through hashtags. So when the hashtag went, when this prominent figure in India said that they would use this hashtag to highlight these ideal women, and obviously ideal women would be the women who are being ideal homemakers or ideal, Hindu women and other things. In fact, there was a group from UK who worked to deliberately direct that hashtag away to highlight the protesting women who happened to be older women, middle-aged to older women in the community in Delhi. And so, ethnography then, so we went in there to look at what was happening. We didn't think that this was what we would see. We were like, what's going on? Let's see. Let's kind of see. Let's scrape a few, hashtags. So we said hashtag Shaheen Bagh, hashtag anti-CAA, and then hashtag She Inspires Us turned up. So, just kind of scraping that data threw us into a field. How do you define the field? We were not there in Delhi. We were not activists there, but we encountered a lot of them. And we encountered, as ethnographers, you end up having to put in your work. They ask you, can you do this for us? And we do what we can. So the point here is that the here and there-ness gets all topsy-turvied. So this traditional academic way of saying, I am an academic and I am going to stay insulated from all these issues because I'm going to write about them objectively, that ain't going to happen. So I don't know if that example was clear, but I just say to your students, get in there, start with a point of entry, think very clearly also about the various points of departure from those places. So my advice is, what are your points of entry and what are your points of departure? And write lots of notes.
Thank you.
Do you have any more questions? I'm sure there are. Yes, please. I see a hand
Oh,
there.
hello. Hi, Radhika. This is Moitri. So, hi. So I know that I kind of probably, have an idea of your work already. So I kind of know. But also, I was wondering if you could kind of talk a little bit about these hashtags as a place, which you then kind of follow through, and and also, as a way of kind of collective identity, which then changes, and the kind of tensions between that.
I have a feeling you know the answer
Yeah.
to it, Moitri.
But I think it's I felt so odd asking, but then again I thought, this is an
No, that's okay.
important.
That's okay. I would say that Moitri is a better person to answer that question than me. But yes, and that's the thing, right? That's what we realized is hashtag, Liz Losh has this Bloomsbury book on hashtag where she talks about, she describes the origins of the idea of hashtag. Hashtags are machine to machine talk. However, here we are human beings, human to human connecting through hashtags. If you want something, you Google a hashtag and you get a ton of conversations that take you to different, as Moitri was saying, places. So if you want to be part of a conversation, it's not just a networking tool, but it's also an affective place tool, right? And what Moitri is referring to is for us as Emily, Sarah, Oladoyin, Olayombo, and I were working on scraping this data and then looking at what was happening. We also got kind of drawn in. We weren't, but we felt very invested in that community in that way. We weren't there, and so. But the point there is, can we say we were there? No, we can't. But we can say that there was a hashtag space that several of us were using, and the hashtag was indeed um, providing a placemaking function in that sense. So it's a little more difficult to talk about the hashtag as placemaking as opposed to, for instance, when um, you know, hashtag in the, as opposed to, I should stop looking at the chat, sorry. As opposed to when you get quote unquote into a virtual environment, whether it's a gaming environment or whether it is a, good old Second Life or other places. But the point is, it's like it itself takes a life of its own. But yeah, let me pause there before I get myself kind of tangled in words. I think Lanandiyar Singh is asking something here about misconception or conception of ethnography meant to have a look at things over a period of time. Yes, I think though it is a period. How do you define the time, right? The reason that Hi, Smita. Hi. The reason that I said you can start where you are is because where you are is a lot of time spent there. So just because I think what you're doing here, Linander, is that you're assuming that just because those of us were not at the Delhi riot, we did not spend time um, in Delhi. You're assuming that we did not spend time in the Indian culture or that we have any relationality related to that, right? So, for instance, Oladoyin is from Nigeria. She has never been to India, but she has spent time in relation to Muslims in Nigeria, which gave her a different perspective altogether on what was going on. So, the point here is it's not about being constantly in one space, but also about relationality. So I don't know if that answered your question at all, but I think we can talk later if you want to contact me. We can talk a little more. So yeah, um, sorry, I should close my chat. Natasha, back to you.
I think there are more questions. So I see a question. Is it Pihu or Pehu? Is saying that one student wants to ask a question, and then also is it Maurice? A couple of questions also. So she says, can you tell us a little bit about autoethnography? So probably now, we're switching to digital autoethnography, I suppose.
You said, what was Pihu's question? I can't scroll back.
Okay, so I'm inviting the questions that are in the chat. There is a kind of announcement of a question coming, so please
Okay.
ask a question. And then Morris asked, can you tell us a
Okay.
little bit about autoethnography, so kind of digital autoethnography?
Yeah. And then that goes back to Annette Markham's talking about self-reflexivity. The point is that autoethnography sometimes risks us being just talking about ourselves. So most of ethnography has to start with positionality, location, saying who you are. Uh, and autoethnography in that sense is one particular mode, but that can't be all of it, in the sense that I do talk a lot about myself and how I use the technology and how I enter the space and who I become and what I become. But if I only talk about that, then I'm not in relation talking, and I'm not examining the power hierarchies around me. So this is not just a issue of autoethnography. I think even anthropologists and ethnographers often fall into this trap of not challenging yourself to look at things from other ways. Truly good autoethnography, however, will do that. It will kind of put yourself through a ringer, so to speak, of constantly counter questioning yourself. So um, I understand the need to distinguish autoethnography from ethnography, but because autoethnography then allows you to center yourself. And autoethnography is very useful, especially in the digital, because then you can say, how do I become who I am in this space? Um, so I don't know if that answered your question, but I know I get confused for being an autoethnographer, but I'm not an autoethnographer. There are many things about myself that I would never reveal in my writing. Autoethnography demands a level of honesty about who you are that I'm not comfortable with revealing all aspects of my life in my writing. But I think true autoethnography would be there. Um, what generally passes sometimes as autoethnography is not necessarily autoethnography. So,
Thank you, Radhika. We have one question here. So for students who are researching on queer studies based on sensitive topics, digital ethnography plays a pivotal role. But often digital ethnography performed on social dating spaces like Grindr and Blued comes with various risks, like recordings, extortions, and different other issues. So the question is how a researcher should mitigate these problems, these risks, and maintain self-reflexivity.
yes, this is a question for Susanna Passanon, who does work on pornography in the digital, amongst other things. But yes, these are risky topics and these are risky spaces. I am by no means saying that you need to go and do all these things in order to be a digital ethnographer. You make your choices. And I would always tell my students to be careful in how they go about it. One thing to remember is that we may be researchers, but we actually are never going to know all of it. We're not going. So if you want to go undercover into any spaces, or if you want to, again, going back to the issue of autoethnography, you would selectively make these choices. You would have, I would advocate a lot of care in how you do this. Ethnography is always partial. I know that's not the answer you probably wanted to hear, but if you want to talk about these sensitive issues a little more in detail, some other time we could talk. But um, again, I'm a cautious person.
Okay, so I suppose, okay, we have another question coming in. So have you done any ethnography in relation to your speciality in digital communication, about how students experience communication in the current pandemic context?
Actually, I have not. I have not done that. I've just been busy dealing with the fact that I have to teach in this pandemic context, and dying of self-pity because I can't go out and have coffee with them. Hopefully the vaccines are coming, but we'll see. So I've not done.
Thank you. Any more questions? Okay.
Can I ask one more then, Natasha?
Yes, sure.
Okay, so
Go.
it can be my question, Radhika then. So all right, so to which extent do you allow ethnographer to be partial in terms of their findings? Because we commonly present the things and say that it's just partial, like no one knows like
Yeah.
I'm with you, but
Thank you for asking. Thank you for asking me that question. What is a dissertation? When is it okay to say, oh my goodness, it's partial, so I don't have to do all this? I think that's a fantastic question. King me, right? Yeah, so no, and I think my students will laugh because, yeah, no, you don't let them get away with asking a question and saying, this is my research question, and I am only going to answer it partially. I think the key here, the key here is to say, what are the different methods you can deploy? And then try to say, even the answers that I have are not going to be full answers. That's what partial is, not that the research itself, the project itself is unfinished. It's always unfinished. That's any other thing, right? This is what we dealing with postmodernism. It's like, oh, postmodernism gives you the permission to call everything performance, to go do everything partially. No, you won't get a job that way.
thank you.
Perhaps, Radhika, we can end on that very positive note with a lot of laughter. And thank you for, oh, there's something going on. What specific? Okay, so one more question, because I think we have time until 1:45. So what specific methods, Radhika, do you use for conducting ethnography? So what would be really specific methods?
Sorry, it varies from project to project. So if I was trying to understand, I mean, what setting up a business on Second Life means, I drew a lot on offline journeys in handloom communities in rural India and in urban India, and conversations that informed me. So I equipped myself with questions to ask about, for instance, what does it mean to weave a sari offline? What goes in there? And then a sari is not a sari in the same way if you have to make a sari in Second Life. So if you want a business in saris in Second Life, the avatars wear them differently. So the methods there involved, yes, ethnography. They involved, ethnographic field work, but they involved conversations, ethnographic conversations, lots and lots of conversations and everything, right? Talk to sari wearers, but you also talk to weavers. And then, of course, on the other side, because the ethnography was digital, it was conversations with a lot of makers and business owners in Second Life. And then trying to learn to make, however imperfectly, my own sari in Second Life. And you saw the imperfect attempt in my first slide, which was actually made from digital images from from a sari I had way back in when I was in my 20s. And so that image says nothing about how the actual offline material sari was woven, which is a very specific kind of weaving technique, which actually has also no, you won't find a sari like that anymore. So, so the point is time, space, and all the other stuff. So that's one instance. And then if I'm trying to do, for instance, with the latest book, and this is what I keep telling my students, is it's a pity that your dissertation cannot be co-authored, because I believe that the relationality and the attribution of the labor of the people who talk to you needs to be an option, right? So in the latest book that I wrote, my ethnographic work was in digital spaces, of various digital spaces, but also drawing on layered generational visits to India and other things, but also with interactions with people of that location here, and lots and lots and lots of remote interviews. So, but then that's where, I ended up co-authoring with a lot of the people several of the people I interviewed, because the subjective experience comes from them as well. So I think Beth has a question as well. And so there are various entry points, and as I mentioned with the project on Shaheen Bagh, we entered through the internet, we entered through social media, Twitter, hashtags.
Thank you, Radhika. So it's a mixed method approach in a way. So you would be there, observe what's happening in relation to different activities going on in digital spaces, but also you would combine that with interviewing as well. So I suppose and also triangulate that with a particular perspective, whether it's a theoretical or conceptual. Yes, Beth is asking if there is time for another question. Yes, Beth, we have a little bit more time. Just wondering about the positionality of the researcher. So how do you introduce yourself to others, to other participants in a digital space, and how do you produce and present yourself? And perhaps I would add to that, what are the challenges, the obstacles that you have dealt with when it comes to approaching participants, for interviews, for example?
And this goes back to I don't do the super risky research. Several people do, so I do not try to understand. I do not do work on suicide cultures, on rape cultures. I mean, rape cultures as they come up in digital publics, but not in an intricate way. And I also, of course, the pornography or even dating and the relational things, I don't do that, because going there, I do not want to hide who I am. And so if somebody talks to me about it, and that's how the recent book came about, is that a lot of young women were willing to talk to me about it. And it's based on a establishment of trust, that I, as a researcher, will not violate their trust if they speak to me about certain things. So even if it sounds like a fantastic thing that I need to, it's an understanding that it has created an understanding, and it is helping me theorize something. Sometimes I have to hold back because I cannot write this. I should, just like I would not write about some of my personal life issues, I would not probably reveal this, because and in some cases the interviews, it is not my place to write their experience. And this is where, for instance, when I was writing when I was engaging the uh, Twitter spaces where the Dalits were in protest move. It was not my place to write their experience. Their experiences to be written by them, and that's where I invited them to co-author. In that sense, then my positionality as the researcher is very is laid out to them. I have no need to be dishonest about it. I know my limitations, and this is where I will say that my research is partial. But I have lots to write about, even without harming the people who need to find their own voice in their own research, and without having to be the person that has empowered the rest of everybody else through my writing. So it is what it is.
Thank you, Radhika. We're getting closer to the end. Maybe just one more thing, just to build on that. So in terms of some concrete strategies that you use in terms of approaching people or having participants in your ethnographic study, how do you go about it? Let's say we're talking about a digital space, a particular group, or it could be a social media space. So do you post in that space asking for participants to contact you? So what would be your strategies?
It's very hard to get in touch with people purely in a digital format. So I suggest you need to make connections offline as well. Go to the communities offline, especially, I mean, people who are doing research in queer communities. You don't want to just post out there. Are you queer? Do you identify as queer? Put the survey out there. You're not going to get many responses. So you have to figure out how you as an ethnographer are a tool to get things out. So if I didn't already have a network of young Indians connecting with me, I wouldn't be able to reach out to them in the Twitter sphere or other spaces to interview them. I got a lot of my interviews for this book also because I actually did a 10-day course on ethnography and methods of digital research in Pune, and a lot of these young people who were using social media for gender and activism were there. So then this is the snowballing technique. So I think I'm not saying don't do the survey. In fact, we always develop a survey, my students, anybody else, to try that out. But the survey is not going to get you much in itself. By all means, do it. Going back to the 1990s, when I first started my research, my survey in those days was about to a list proc of South Asian women. I probably got like 10 responses, which were not at all satisfactory. It's really hard to develop an ethnographic survey as well. And this is where digital ethnography is not survey research. Ethnography is not just textual analysis, right? It's all of these together. So see what you can get in different ways. Having said that, sometimes when you're doing your IRB proposal, they will want to see your questions in your survey, because at least where I am, they don't understand what ethnography is. They want to know. So you take the permission to interview people.
Brilliant. We have run out of time. No more questions. Thank you, Radhika, for your time. It's early morning in the States, so thank you for yes, thank you for this webinar. It's been amazing.
Coffee, anyone?
Yes. Okay. So thank you, and also thanks to everyone attending the seminar. And I would just say a few words about the upcoming. I'm just trying now to to open that piece of document, because I think I have probably lost it in the meantime. So just let me see. Dee, perhaps you could help me with announcing our next speaker, please. If Dee is around, or we will just... Okay. Okay, I think without further waiting, we will close the session for today.
Sorry, I was just trying to find it, Natasha.
That's okay, Dee, because I lost my
okay.
document, so I don't know it by heart.
Right, so this is next Wednesday, the 17th of March. It's Professor Carrie Peacher she was the director, Nottingham Centre for Children, Young People and Families at Nottingham Trent University. And the title is LGBTQI plus parented families and schools. And everybody's welcome to attend that as well.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dee. Okay, thank you, everyone. Have a great day, morning, evening. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.